Your voice comes out still strange.
Okay,
but apparently my voice doesn't come out strange. Since,
okay, start, please.
you want me to start? Okay, this week's Sedra is Parshas Eikev. In Parshas Eikev, the Torah says, Mamrim Hayit, now in the 9th Parak Tes, Pasuk Chav Daled, Moshe Rabbeinu is discussing with the Jewish people what happened in the past and how they should prepare themselves for the future. And he uses the expression, Mamrim Hayisim im Hashem miyom daiti eschem. You were rebellious with God from the day I knew you. However, previously, a couple psukim beforehand, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Zochar al tishkach. Remember, don't forget, Asher hiksafta es Hashem elkecha b'midbar, how you angered God in the desert. L'min hayom, from the day Asher yitzasa me'eretz Mitzrayim, that you left the land of Egypt. Until this very day that you came to this place. Mamrim hayisim im Hashem elokechem. You were rebellious with God, your God. So it seems very strange. On one hand, Moshe Rabbeinu says, you were rebellious with God from the day I knew you. On the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu says, you were rebellious with God from the day you left the land of Egypt. Now we know that Moshe Rabbeinu knew the Jewish people long before they left the land of Egypt. The Torah tells us in Shemos, Vayihi Vayamim, it was in those days, Vayigdal Moshe, Moshe became big. Vayetze Alachav, he went out to his brothers, and there is the Medrash says, Vayigdal Moshe, how old was he then? So there's one Medrash that says he was 13, and there's another Medrash that says he was 20. Vayar b'sivlosam, he saw their burdens, he saw their slavery. Vayarish Mitzri, and he saw an Egyptian smiting a Jew. But so we see that Moshe was acquainted and involved with the Jewish people from the age of 13 or 20, and perhaps even before that, because he was brought up in the house of Yocheved and Amram. And Yocheved and Amram, they were the leaders of the Jewish people. And Moshe Rabbeinu, when he took the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, so at that time he was 83 years old. So how could one pasuk say, you have been rebellious with God from the day I knew you? And the other pasuk says, you were rebellious with God from the day you left the land of Egypt. There seems to be a discrepancy of about 60 years, at least 60 years. Now, we are fast approaching the month of Elul, a little bit over 2 weeks. We have 2 more Shabbosim before the month of Elul. And there is a custom in Elul to blow the shofar. It's based on a medrash in the Pirkei of Rabbi Lezer, because when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Mount Sinai to receive the second set of the luchos, of the tablets of the 10 Commandments, So the Jewish people, they blew a shofar. And Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Mount Sinai. The second time he went on Rosh Chodesh Elul. So, and according to one textual reading in the Pirkei of Rabbi Lezer, not only when he went up to Mount Sinai, they blew the shofar, but they blew the shofar every day that he was up on Mount Sinai. So that is the precedent on which the custom of blowing the shofar every day in the month of Elul is based upon. Now, it's very interesting that the Medrash says, why did they blow the shofar at that time when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Mount Sinai? And according to one textual reading, even every day while he was on Mount Sinai, it was in order to prevent the Jews from committing the blunder they made the first time Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Mount Sinai. Because the first time Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Mount Sinai, at a certain point, the Jews began to think that Moshe Rabbeinu is not coming down. And because of that, they forced Aaron to build for them a golden calf. And the purpose of the blowing of the shofar was for the Jewish people, to make sure that the Jewish people do not commit that same blunder again. And the question is, how was the blowing of the shofar able to prevent the Jewish people from committing that blunder again? What was the message of the shofar? And how did it have its impact that prevented the Jewish people from building another golden calf? Now, the shofar, the blowing of the shofar is a mitzvah every year on Rosh Hashanah. But in the time that the Beis Hamikdash was in existence, when the Sanhedrin was there, so the shofar was also blown on the Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year. But there is a difference. The Rambam actually counts it as two separate mitzvos. There is a difference between the mitzvah of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah and the mitzvah of blowing the shofar in the Jubilee year on Yom HaKippurim. The Mefarshim point out that the mitzvah of blowing the shofar, certainly according to the Rambam, on Rosh Hashanah, is a mitzvah of hearing the sound of the shofar. Lishmoa kol shofar, the bracha, the blessing that we make before the shofar is blown is lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the sound of the shofar. On the Jubilee year, however, the mitzvah of blowing the shofar is not a mitzvah of hearing the shofar, it's a mitzvah of blowing the shofar. That's why on Rosh Hashanah, it's not just the person who blows the shofar that has the mitzvah. It's all the Jews that hear the shofar, they fulfill the mitzvah. There is no Jubilee, presently, there is no Jubilee year. But when there was a Jubilee year on Yom Kippurim, according to the Rambam, it's possible that others disagree, but according to the Rambam, we couldn't fulfill the mitzvah of shofar merely on the Jubilee year, on Yom Kippurim of the Jubilee year, by merely hearing the sound of the shofar. Each Jew would have to blow the shofar himself. We probably would need to create classes beforehand on how to blow the shofar. But in final analysis, the mitzvah of of shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a mitzvah of hearing the shofar. The mitzvah of the mitzvah of shofar in the Jubilee year is a mitzvah of blowing the shofar. So it's obvious that there are certain, on one hand, there is a similarity between the mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah of every year and the mitzvah of shofar on the Jubilee year. After all, both are a mitzvah of shofar. But on the other hand, there's clearly a difference. And we have to understand what is the similarity and why there are differences. Now, Rosh Hashanah is the first of the Rosh Hashanah is the first of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva. Yom HaKippurim, that is the 10th day, that's the last day of the 10 days of repentance. Now, how Yom Kippur manifests itself as a day of repentance is obvious. On Yom Kippurim we fast. On Yom Kippurim we say the vidui, we say the confessional prayer. But in Rosh Hashanah, except according to the opinion of the Ari, there is no confessional prayer. And in Rosh Hashanah, we're, according to most poskim, there is a dispute about it. According to most poskim, one is even not allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah. From the pasuk in Ezra, it appears that way. That they were told not to fast on Rosh Hashanah. So the question is, how does Rosh Hashanah manifest itself as a day of tshuva, as a day of repentance that makes it the first day of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva? It's true that some have a custom of going to the river to say prayers of asking for forgiveness, but that is a later custom. And those who follow the practices of the Vilna Gaon do not even do that, do not say tashlich. So the question is, how does Rosh Hashanah halachically manifest itself as a day of tshuva, as a day of repentance? Now, I've mentioned very often the question concerning the Haggadah. In the Haggadah we say, in the Dayenus, Ilu kervanu lifnei har Sinai. If God has brought us close at Mount Sinai, v'lo nasan lanu es Torah, and He didn't give us the Torah, Dayenu, that in itself would have been very great. And the obvious question is, what would have been the significance to come to Mount Sinai and not receive the Torah? Now, my father, not in regard to this question, would always talk. I know he mentioned at the hesped, at the eulogy for his mother, he said, besides the Torah that we received at Mount Sinai, there was also the experience of Sinai. He said that his main teacher, when it came to the Torah itself, was his father. But when it came to the experience of Sinai, the one who transmitted to him the experience of Sinai, that was primarily done through his mother. The Torah was given over through his father. The experience of Sinai primarily was given over through his mother. And my uncle in his hesped actually echoed the same idea. He said, he refers to it as the Torah of Sinai was given to him by his father, but the kolos who brought him, the sounds of Sinai. My father would call it the fire of Sinai. My uncle called it the kolos ubrakim of Sinai. That was given over by his mother. But the question is, what was the experience of Sinai? Okay, you can call it the fire of Sinai. You could call it the kolos ubrakim of Sinai. But what did it manifest itself in regard to the Jew itself? It wasn't just an observance of a certain phenomena. It was much more than that. I think, Ilu kervanu lefnei har Sinai, if God brought us close at Mount Sinai, doesn't mean God brought us close to Mount Sinai, but it means that God brought us close to Him at Mount Sinai. The Jewish people at Mount Sinai sensed the presence of God. There was revelation in addition to getting the Torah. And how did God make himself known to the Jewish people? We say in the Musaf Shemana Esrei, Uvekol shofar hafata, you made your presence known to the Jewish people with the sound of the shofar. And I think a Jew who on one hand, the Jew who sins, he in a sense is rejecting Sinai, but he is not just rejecting the Torah of Sinai. He's rejecting the experience of Sinai also. You could call it, how does a Jew come to sin? How is it possible for a Jew to sin? It's what I call the Ostrich Approach. I don't know that ostriches really do this, but it's commonly believed that when an enemy is attacking an ostrich, it puts its head in the sand. And it's very difficult for a Jew to sin knowing that God is there. The obligation of a Jew is not just to perpetuate the Torah of Sinai. He has to perpetuate the experience of Sinai as well. And the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, in a sense, is a re-acceptance of Sinai. But it's not enough to re-accept the Torah of Sinai. And perhaps that is the main aspect of Yom Kippurim when we say the Vidui. We're re-accepting the mitzvahs of the Torah that unfortunately we rejected. But first, we have to re-undergo and perpetuate the experience of Sinai. Uvekol shofar hafata, sensing the presence of God. That's the way. That's the way that's the way we do tshuva. In other words, we perpetuate the experience of sensing the presence of God. And now, I already mentioned the medrash that says that the first three, the psukim of the first three haftorahs of the Shiva Nechemta, God tells the Navi, the last week's haftorah, Nachmu, Nachmu Ami. And this coming week's Sedra, God tells the Nevi'im, God tells the prophets, go, console my people. And then the Jewish people reject the Nechama, reject the consolation of the prophets. And then in the next week's Haftarah, the Navi comes back and says, Aniyah Sarah lo Nechama, the Jewish people rejected it. So in other words, the first 3 weeks of the 7 weeks of Nechama is based on the fact that the Jew is not satisfied with a relationship with an intermediary. with just an intermediary. The Jew wants to have, of course, that's very important. The Nevi'im are very important. Moshe Rabbeinu is very important. But the Jew has to have his personal relationship with God. Now, the Jewish people, 40 days after saying Na'aseh v'nishma, after accepting the Torah, after being in what our sages say was a level of higher than the angels, stood in front of a golden calf and said, Elu Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel. How could they go in the matter of 40 days from such a high level to the depths of standing in front of the golden calf and saying, this is your God, O Israel? But there was a change in the situation. The change in the situation was that Moshe Rabbeinu was not there anymore. In other words, the Jewish people reached a level higher than angels, being in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the truth of the matter is, it wasn't just the Jewish people. A little later on, and that is the foundation for Tisha B'Av, when the Meraglim, the spies, and who were the spies? Rosh Bnei Yisrael Hema. And Rashi mentions that when they went out to spy the land of Israel for the Jewish people, they were Anoshim Tzadikim. They were righteous people, leaders of the Jewish people. And then 40 days later, they come back and they lead a rebellion against Moshe. How are we to understand it? Anoshim Tzadikim, righteous people. But the answer is, you could be righteous within a given milieu. But when the situation changes, we have to worry how the commitment might crumble. And it's very interesting. The pasuk also in this week's Sedra, Parak Yud, pasuk Yud Beis, the Torah says, "Va'ata Yisrael," and now Israel. Ma Hashem Elokecha Sholem Me'imcha. What does God ask from you? Except Tiyim Liyiro, so to fear Him, to follow Him in all His ways, and to love Him, and to serve Him with your whole heart and with your whole soul. And our sages say, "V'chil milsa zutrayihi." What do you mean? What does God ask? Is it so easy? Is it so simple for the Jew to serve God, to fear God, to follow Him in all His ways, and to love Him and to serve Him with his whole heart and with his whole soul? Is that a small thing? To say, what does God ask from you? And the Chazal tell us, Ein, Gabe Moshe milsa zutrayi. By Moshe, it is a small thing. And the question everybody asks, the Torah wasn't given just for Moshe. So, what do you mean, Gabe Moshe? By Moshe, it was a small thing. And there are a number of answers we could give. But one answer, the Malbim, Baal Tanya, they say very similar things, might not be exactly the same, but the basic answer that's given is Gabe Moshe doesn't mean in regard to Moshe. It means when you are by Moshe. In other words, it's one thing to be committed to Torah and mitzvos when you're standing next to Moshe. It's another thing to be committed to Torah and mitzvos when Moshe Rabbeinu is not there. And in a sense, that's the test. The way you evaluate a yeshiva is not how much the students are learning when they're in yeshiva, or how they act when they're within the confines of the yeshiva. The test is later on. When they're by their rebellion, it's one thing. And in a sense, this was the test that the Jewish people faced when Moshe Rabbeinu went on top of the mountain. So, in a sense, what they needed is this ability. They could only through Moshe were they able to sense the presence of God. And the blowing of the shofar, over kol shofar hafata, was perpetuating the experience of Sinai, of sensing the presence of God when even Moshe wasn't there. And that prevented them from building another golden calf. But the question is, why is it that the Jewish people, their dedication to God, their identification with God, their recognition, their commitment, was all dependent upon Moshe being there? After all, the Jewish people, they heard God's voice at Mount Sinai. Okay, it's true, according to the Rambam. They just heard the voice. The words themselves, they didn't hear. Moshe had to say the words over for them. And Kriyas Yamsuf, at the splitting of the sea, they said, Zekeli van Veyu, this is my God. One would have expected them to be able to maintain that personal relationship with God, even when Moshe would not be there. Why is it that everything was dependent upon Moshe being there? And I think the reason is, this was as a result of the Avdus experience, of the servile perspective that they had of themselves. In other words, a slave, everything is dependent upon the master. And it's because the master is there that he does his obligations. And Moshe Rabbeinu was sort of like a transference. Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader of the Jewish people, came in place of Paro, who was the leader of Egypt, and thereby the leader of the Jewish people in their minds when they war in Egypt. When the master is there, you serve the master. But when the master is not there, sometimes everything shatters. And that's why it was this servile perspective, the need for the master being there, that played such a role in the Jewish people's connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. Now, it could be suggested that in addition to the sound of the shofar being emphasizing the presence of God. The sound of the shofar has another message, and that is the message of freedom. And let me explain what I mean. The Aseret Dibros, when God appeared at Mount Sinai, and said to the Jewish people that the Aseret Dibros, he said, "Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeisicha mi'eretz Mitzrayim mibeis avodim." I am the God. This is how the Aseret Dibros, God introduces himself to the Jewish people in the Aseret Dibros in the Ten Commandments as the one who freed the Jewish people. In a sense, God was telling the Jewish people that the Aseret Dibros, the giving of the Torah, that is part of their being free. Because until the Jewish people had their own culture, they weren't free. The Torah represents the culture of the Jewish people. And it's very interesting. The Torah tells us that when they blew the shofar on the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, so ukrosem dror baritz, you shall call out freedom throughout the land. I think that was put on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Krosem dror baritz, and in the Jubilee year, property was returned. But even more important, the slaves all went out free. So I think the sound of the shofar is the sound of freedom. Matter of fact, the Yerushalmi says that if somebody says that he wants to remain a slave more than the 7 years prescribed, so he gets his ear pierced, a hole in his ear. It's not just pierced, a hole in his ear. Why? Ozen sheshamal har Sinai, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai. Kili Bnei Yisrael avodim, the Jewish people are my servants. And he sold himself as a slave. They're my servants, not the servants of the servants of servants. Yerot said there has to have a hole put into it. Now, where in Mount Sinai, where in the Aseret Dibros does it say Kili Bnei Yisrael avodim? But in Mount Sinai, the Jewish people heard the sound of the shofar. Over kol shofar hafata. And the sound of the shofar is across some dror baretz. You call out freedom throughout the land. That's Kili Bnei Yisrael avodim. That you are free. You are no longer servants of Egypt. It's not enough to leave the land of Egypt. You have to take Egypt out of you. And it's very interesting. The Gemara in Brachas tells us about the different philos, the different prayers that some of our sages would say when they finished the Shemona Esrei. One of those prayers is Ritzonenu lasos ritzoncha. It is our desire to do your will. 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 It is our desire to do your will it's our desire to do your desire. Umimakev, who prevents us from doing it? She'or shebisa, the yeast in the dough, the shibud malchios, and the enslavement of the nations. Now, what is Sor shebisa, the yeast of the dough? That's a word that's used to describe, the Rishonim tell us, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclinations in man. The lack of control on one's instincts. And that's a sign, that's a servile perspective. The Torah tells us, Avda behefkera nichale, a slave has unbridled lust. He wants to feel free to do. He doesn't want any control. He doesn't want self-imposed control. So, and Shibud Malchios in the old days meant when we're in jail, when we are whipped, when we are punished for serving God. Today, there is still Shibud Malchios. Today, we're not whipped for serving God. We're not enslaved today, but we can become cultural slaves of the nations of the world. So, in a sense, what is tshuva? Tshuva is to realize that we are free, that we're no longer slaves, that we're not slaves to the culture of the society we find ourselves in. And we are not slaves to our instincts, that we control ourselves. Being free doesn't just mean that no one else controls us. Being truly free means that we control ourselves. So the sound of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is the same thing as the sound of the shofar on the Jubilee year. The difference is, on the Jubilee year, we have to let others know that they're free. We have to let the slaves know that they're free. We have to let people know that they can come back and get their own property. So the mitzvah is blowing the shofar, making known. Rosh Hashanah, the mitzvah is hearing the shofar. It's important for us to hear the sound of the shofar. We have to realize that we're no longer slaves to Paro or of Paro's successors. And it's very interesting. There is a certain letter of the Rambam where the Rambam himself uses this expression, Paro hu hayetzer hara. Paro is the Yetzer Hara in man. What does it mean? Paro is the Yetzer Hara. But we just as we were enslaved to Paro, we can be enslaved to our own instincts. We only are free if we are in control of ourselves. Now, so this is the idea on Rosh Hashanah and an Elul. We have to realize that we are free. And when we fail to sense the two are really one, when we fail to sense the presence of God, and Moshe or whoever is our teacher is not there, then we immediately have the perspective of slaves. And it's very interesting. And so Rosh Hashanah, we hear that we are free. We're no longer slaves. We do not have a servile perspective. We have our own culture, and the culture is the culture of the Torah. Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher tzeisecha me'eretz Mitzrayim beis avadim. I am the God who took you out of the land of Egypt, so you should be free. But it's interesting when you take a look at the whole Torah. As the Jewish people are traversing the desert, see, time and time again, the Jews are rebelling. How long after Kriyas Yamsuf are the Jews rebelling? Time and time again, and they have so many miracles, and they rebel, and they rebel, and they rebel. How are we to understand this? Why is it that they rebel? Well, to a certain degree, we could suggest that when you have constant miracles, the miracles and nature become one. And when miracles and nature become one, the miracles stop making an impression upon us. According to many Mefarshim, the Rambam disagrees, but all of nature's miracles. It's just miracles that repeat itself day after day. But I think it's more than just that. There's a very interesting Medrash Tanchuma. There are two texts in the Medrash Tanchuma. But according to one text of the Medrash Tanchuma, when the Jewish people came to Morah, it says, Lo yuchlu Bnei Yisrael lishtos mayim mimorah ki morim heim. They weren't able to drink water from Morah because they were bitter. And the Medrash says they were bitter can be interpreted in two ways. The water was bitter, or the Jews were bitter. In other words, it wasn't just that the water was bitter. Part of the problem was that the Jews were bitter. Why were the Jews bitter? But I would like to suggest that the Jews were bitter because of their experiences in Egypt. Because they were slaves in Egypt. Because their children were killed in Egypt. That's why they were bitter. What happened? There was a transference. Moshe Rabbeinu became their Paro in their minds. Moshe became their leader. And all the feelings that they had against their former leader came out against Moshe. That servile perspective. They were still slaves, even though they were free. It's almost the Medrash, the Gemara tells us that in the Jubilee year, the slaves stopped work on Rosh Hashanah, but they stayed in their master's house until the blowing of the shofar on Yom Kippur. Here, they were not in Egypt anymore. They weren't subject to those in charge of the slaves, but they remained slaves. So in this part of the idea of the shofar of Sinai, the shofar of Rosh Hashanah is we are free. The idea of free is that we have to realize that Paro is not here, that we cannot make transferences from Paro to Moshe. Now, it's very interesting. I mentioned at the very beginning, Pasuk Mamrim Hayisim im Hashem miyom daiti estem. You were rebellious to God from the day I knew you. But the other pasuk says, Mamrim Hayisem miyom seisem Mitzrayim. You were rebellious from the day you went out of Egypt. Now, in the pasuk, in the verse that says you were rebellious with God, the word mamrim, rebellious, the first mem is a mem zeira. It's a small mem. It's a little bit smaller. If you look in the Sefer Torah, you have to know ahead of time that it's smaller to recognize that it's smaller. But it's a mem zeira. In other words, if we ignore the first mem, the word is marim hayisem. Why were the Jews rebellious against God? The Jews were rebellious against God because of the bitterness. Where did the bitterness come from? The bitterness came from the Jewish people being in the bitterness came from the Jewish people being enslaved for so many years, being tortured for so many years, losing their children. And that was the foundation of their rebellion. When they were in Egypt, they weren't so much rebellious against God. They were bitter against God. From the time I knew you, I saw the rebelliousness to a certain degree that's going to come. The source of the rebelliousness was the bitterness. But in Egypt, it was primarily bitterness that manifests itself later on primarily in rebelliousness. But from the time they went out of Egypt, the bitterness primarily manifests itself in rebelliousness. And this is what we have to know. The purpose of the sound of the shofar is, on one hand, to sense the presence of God. And when we sense the presence of God, we know that we are free. We do not become enslaved to ourselves, and we do not become enslaved to the nations of the world. And that's why the Jewish people, because they didn't understand the experience of Sinai, they didn't perpetuate the experience of Sinai. That's why they built the golden calf. So they had to perpetuate the experience of Sinai. And we in Elul and Rosh Hashanah, we have to do the same thing. We have to perpetuate the experience of Sinai, of sensing the presence of God, and at the same time, to recognize that we're free, and true freedom manifests itself in commitment and devotion to the culture that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave, that God gave us, and that is the Torah. Okay. All right, that's it.
I don't know if you could hear me now, but thank you. If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat box. And Rabbi Soloveichik discussed the culture of the Jewish people in the Haggadah share several months ago, and it should be on YouTube if you weren't here for that share. One question, being free, truly free means we control ourselves. So the question is, many believe this depends on going to the best yeshiva or living in the right community or growing up with the right family. Does the rabbi believe the spiritual freedom requires something else?
Spiritual freedom means to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu as best as we can. And going to the right yeshiva, coming from the right family. I don't know what the right family is, and I don't know what the right yeshiva is. There's no right yeshiva. It's a question of which is the best yeshiva for a particular boy. But whatever it is, I just want to add, One, when they send their children to yeshiva, they do not surrender their children. They have to play a role in bringing their children up as well. Okay.
No other questions yet. So did you say that on Rosh Hashanah it's tshuva because we have to
It's the tshuva manifests itself in the
experience.
Yeah, Sinai.
And did you say that on Yom Kippur, when we say vidoy, we re-accept the mitzvos?
Yeah, the truth is in Yom Kippur you have both, but the Rosh Hashanah is primarily dedicated to the experience of Sinai, and Yom Kippur is dedicated primarily to the re-acceptance of the mitzvos.
Is that because on Yom Kippur that was the day that Moshe came down with the second luchos?
That's right. They're accepting Seres HaDibros, which represents the mitzvos of the Torah.
I don't see other questions here.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
It'll be up on the YouTube channel later today. Just search Rabbi Moshe Soloveichik. I think the channel is the same as my name here, Rabbi B. Lazowski. I think that's the name of the channel on YouTube. Everyone have a good week, and God willing, we'll see you again next Sunday at the same time, same code.
Okay.